Welcome to The Drop and our Succession Recap podcast. I'm Osman Faruqi. I'm here with Thomas Mitchell and Mel Kembry to break down episode 8 of Succession season 4. How are you guys doing?
Not as good as you in Rome.
Yeah, I am in Rome. If anything sounds slightly different, that is why. For a special little project that we will be sharing on The Drop next week, actually. I do feel mildly Roy-esque hanging out in Rome while we record this podcast. How's Sydney?
I was going to say, you're going to be in Norway next week, or you're doing like the Succession tour, slowly going to all the different hotspots?
Well, there may be some reasons for me to go to Scandinavia, as we've discussed in our private chats.
Yes,
Thomas, I hear there's a prime minister who's recently single. I don't know if we should talk about that.
I think we definitely should. Look, to be honest, I feel both stressed and relieved. This was an amazing Succession episode. It was like, I've said it like 5 times before, it was Succession at its best, but my God, it was intense and like not just stress in a Succession way with fast dialogue and lots going on, but like literally stress with like the content of this episode.
Yeah, there's 2 things I love in this world. It's prestige, like TV shows that HBO serves us up, and it is elections, and in particular, election night. Like, I'm such a nerd, even though I live in Victoria. On election night, I hosted, no one came except my housemate, a New South Wales election night party, and we ended up just watching, like, highlights of the best federal elections from the past 10, 15 years. So you give me a Succession episode that is set in a newsroom on election night, like I am absolutely there for it.
I'm like you, I was raised on a diet of kind of journalism, films and TV shows. And then I think also having been in a newsroom on election night, I thought they captured the kind of chaos of it in a newsroom so well.
And there's always like a Tom figure who's like meant to be in control, but you can see them just like slowly melting down in front of your eyes.
It's often me. The episode, it was actually pretty dark. We were talking just before we started this recording that kind of left us feeling pretty like something wasn't quite right in the world, like a little bit sick in the stomach. It felt like so many of the chickens of this show, of this season, were coming home to roost. And the show normally is so insular, right? It's just focused on the Roys, their machinations, and we don't get too much about what the impact of that is on the outside world, other than a couple of references to what ATN did and Logan's sort of views on global politics. But this episode was basically all big picture stuff. It's like, you thought this was a show about these siblings fighting and the daddy issues they've got. Joke's on you. It's actually about what happens when those people run an enormously powerful media empire, and that leads to fascism. Like, their family fuck-ups led to fascism in this episode. It was such an extraordinary, like, massive shift in terms of the stakes of this entire television show.
I'd be interested to see how this lands in the US, because to me, it triggered a bit of Trump trauma in a way, and that kind of sense of destabilization and pending apocalypse that people felt when Trump was elected. And to me, it spoke to that very, very strongly.
I was going to say the same. I mean, we've been living in this, I guess, like the post-Trump era, and especially now with, I guess, the lawsuit at Fox playing out, and so it's all kind of back in the news cycle. But especially the way that, you know, early on to the episode, I know we'll get into it in a second, but, you know, even when Menken's talking about, like, he's not focused on winning right now, he's focused on losing and what the narrative means, like, it was so kind of, like, unnerving to watch how these people control the narrative and how aware they are of, like, how important that will be and how much sway they have. It was, it was very kind of like, it was an uncomfortable Succession episode, but amazing.
And I think you're right, Oz, like we've felt this whole time in a way like we're watching these people live this life of luxury, and that's fun to be a voyeur in that world without seeing the kind of consequences it has for the rest of us. But this episode really strongly drew the link between this kind of world of the 1% that we were enjoying as outsiders to showing how that world really directly affects us.
Yeah, a lot of real one-for-one, like-for-like comparisons to things that have been playing out in the last couple of weeks. Like, that's the great thing about the writing of the show is they obviously can't predict what is going to happen in the real world with things like the Fox News Dominion case and how that settles. And there's a lot of references to ongoing legal dramas that may be impacting the election. But there's a perceptiveness there in the writing, which is these are the things that could happen and we're not totally sure yet, but let's like include them in the show. And then you end up watching it in real time and things are happening in the real world as well. That has been a really key part of this season too. Before we get too deep on that stuff, let's get into a recap of what we saw play out in this episode. It's set on Election Day. Democratic candidate Daniel Jimenez is squaring off against the Republican Jared Mencken. Roman is very strongly backing Mencken, both because he seems to have a weird sexual obsession with him and because Mencken seems pretty likely to block the Gojo-Waystar merger, which Roman and Kendall are keen to stop happening. Shiv, on the other hand, is rooting for Jimenez, not just because she's kind of more politically progressive than her brothers, but also because Jimenez is unlikely to block the merger, which benefits her and her alliance with Matsson. Kendall starts a little bit in the middle, trying to maintain a good relationship with whoever might win. Tom is in charge of the coverage at ATN. It's not going well. He doesn't want coffee, but he turns to cocaine and Greg to help him get through the night. And the real turning point of the episode hinges on this moment around whether or not ATN should call the election for Jared Mencken, partly on the basis of this dubious vote result in Wisconsin that exists due to a mysterious fire in a voting center. Kendall discovers that Shiv's been lying to him about her alliance with Matsson. That tips him over the edge and he decides to back Mencken. ATN calls the election for him, giving him the momentum he needs to potentially secure the leadership of the Republic, and everyone but Roman Roy is left feeling very uneasy about where the country is going. As we said earlier, like, it felt weird to have that feeling of like things are not going well, and then you remember, oh no, this actually did happen like 6 or 7 years ago. It was such a evocative way, I think, to make us feel scared about fascism in the US and the rise of a Trump-like figure when we'd already gone through it. Did you guys feel that?
Yeah, and there were all these kind of small moments where they would capture the look of just the every person, and on their face they'd just zoom in and show Pam or Darwin, or they'd had that, one of my favourite scenes was that moment between Greg and Jess when they were in the corridor about to deliver the news that ATN had called it. And there's just this sense of all these small people being swept up in this really big historical moment, which I think is a sense we could all relate to around that election of Trump when we were all kind of watching it play out here.
Yeah, it was interesting because like, there is like a bunch of people that just work at ATN because like that's their job, and then suddenly you find yourself involved in this, you know, massive decision. Yeah, I mean, for me it was very strange to watch. Like, obviously we talked about it, but you know, at the 2020 election, Fox calls, you know, Arizona for Biden. They call too early. It ends up being correct, but it was this huge thing, and I think like that it's commonly known now that Rupert Murdoch was the one to make that call. And you know, it's so bizarre to watch that happening in the show because, I mean, firstly, there's still no real leader between the three of them. Like, Tom is in charge of ATN, but he defers to all three kids who all have their own agendas. But just watching, like, how much, you know, how important a decision can be made by these three people who all want their own selfish ends. Like, and then the impact of that is, like, the direction of an entire country.
Also, maybe a fun fact, but when I was doing some research, because I didn't want to be the parable person of the episode.
It's always got to be someone.
Didn't want to be that person, so I thought, I'll brush up on my political history. I discovered that the Fox News Decision Desk Director, his name was Arnon, and like, I don't know, maybe it's a far stretch to say that Darwin was the name of, like, you know, that they were creating an echo, but it made me think, like, how many of these Easter eggs am I missing in succession? And I think that's probably one of the reasons why people just go back and rewatch it over and over again, because there are all these kind of little hidden moments that you might not pick up straight away.
Yeah, there was a moment at the end of this episode I only really clocked the second time around where Tom, after making the call, leans to Greg and is like, can we get like a historian on to tell people that this has happened before? It's like they were grappling with the consequences of what they've just done. They were sort of flying by the seat of pants and not really sure about it. I was thinking, to your point, Thomas, about the real world Arizona call, like there was so much internal division we now know in the Fox Trump empire kind of, you know, alliance around how to handle something like this. Jared Kushner was basically, you know, had a back channel in to Fox and was saying, guys, like, if you do this, like, this will end your relationship with the Trump campaign. One thing I want to ask you guys about is, we're talking about an election, but we're talking about it through the prism of the media, right? And it's like, a vote is a vote is a vote. Whoever wins an election, that's decided by, nominally, you count up the ballots and the winner is the person who wins most of the votes. What the media has to do with that, in a literal sense, is kind of nothing, right? You can opine and you can propagandize and you can say, this guy won. If the numbers aren't there, the numbers aren't there. But I feel like what we've learned in the last few years, particularly in the United States, and I feel like this is what the show is trying to say, is that that's actually not true. Like, you might think that democracy is just about who goes to the polling booth and who votes for who, but it's so much more complicated than that. There is this constant theme in this episode of the narrative. Like, the votes are almost irrelevant compared to having a story that suits you, because whether you win or you lose, you can portray yourself as the victor or the person who was screwed over. I feel like that was like a big point of what this episode was trying to say.
Yeah, and Roman has that great line where he says, even if you're not the president, you're our president, which really speaks to that sense that in the media, they're not just witnessing history, they're actively creating it.
Yeah, and again, we spoke about it before, like the Mencken bit of when he says, like, at the start of the episode, things aren't tracking well for him. The early polls are not projecting well for Mencken. And it's kind of expected. Like, the general tone is that he's probably not going to win. And so he has a chat with Roman and says, like, look, I'm not focused on winning right now. I'm focused on losing and what that narrative will look like and how we will portray me. So then the next election, we'll make sure that, like, everything is set up for me to win. But yeah, I found that really interesting because I kind of had a lot of those same thoughts. Like, I watched this with my wife, and I'm sure she won't mind me saying this. She was a little bit like, what the fuck is going on here? And I was like, well, allow me to explain US politics to you because it is a specialty of mine. No, but like, she was like, what's the deal though? Like, they can't, it's not like if they call it early, they stop counting the votes because like, Fox News has called it. But no, what the main takeaway that we collectively came together is that like, it is about that narrative and when they call Arizona for Mencken, he's going to win Arizona, but it's the Wisconsin that's the issue. They call it when no one else has and no one really should because there's an issue around these burned votes. But then once they call that and it pushes him over the line, no one else wants to be like last to call the election. So suddenly everyone falls into line and the narrative becomes that Mencken is the president-elect. And eventually down the line, that issue of the burned votes just becomes like secondary. It's like a faded memory.
Yeah, and even if there's like a court case, they talk about, a legal process that will play out. It could take 3 months. That's 3 months where the media has anointed, in this case, Jared Mencken, the president-to-be. And so then you end up in a situation where the Supreme Court is trying to overturn like the legitimacy of the president. So either way, whatever the actual on-paper result is, it suits, in this case, Jared Mencken.
Yeah, it becomes like the world's most important too hard basket. Like, unfortunately, we said it like 3 months ago, so like.
But part of me wondered whether like the barb was not so much directed at the media generally, but at the media as a weapon of big business, and it was kind of an attack on media concentration and how these kind of uber businesses can turn the media into a propaganda wing. So that was kind of, I didn't see it as the media in general, but more the ATN brand of media.
And the very cozy relationship between politicians on all sides and the corporate media, right? Like, you've got Jimenez's team, personified by Nate, who's supposed to be the good guys. Like, they nominally exist to be kind of anti-ATN, they're anti-Jared Mencken. They've got a direct line into the campaign. They are wheeling and dealing as much as anyone. And it just feels like such a real example of how power really plays out. You might see politicians decry the negative influence of the Australian newspaper or Sky News or whatever. I guarantee you that they have the phone numbers of all the editors, of all the political journalists, and they are working with them as much as they are any other media outlet. And the show wasn't pulling its punches when it was, I think, criticizing the so-called like left-wing side of politics as much as the right-wing.
That's why, and I know this will no doubt trigger you, Mel, but like I was proud of our boy Ken in this episode. He like at the start, he was like, let me speak to Daniel. I hope someone wins this election and his name is Daniel. But he knew that they had to also keep Mencken on side. Like, he just wanted to, like, he was doing the right thing. Like, the reality is they're running a major news corporation. They have to have good relationships with two potential nominees, one of which the next day will be leading the country. And he's just, like, doing the thing. And then the other two siblings are, like, so closely affiliated. Kendall is just so sensible. And I'm proud.
The sensible centre, represented by Kendall Roy.
So rolled here. All he was like, this was, I call this sad Kendall, because he does that thing where he puts his chin down and he like looks up and he stands in corners
really
of
hangdog.
rooms and he speaks really slowly and really low voice. And this just goes back to what I've always said. He's unstable.
Yeah, but also he
doesn't
misses
have a value system, so he's constantly conflicted. Now he wants to be the good guy. He doesn't know whether he wants to be that all the time.
Also because he misses his daughters. It's so sad.
Does he miss them that much? He wasn't with them.
Before we get too deep on the character analysis, I want to talk a bit about, not to bring it back to your wife, Thomas, who I love and adore and I think is very smart. But I think
is she in Rome with you right now? She's been gone for like 3 days.
She might be seen with those kind of compliments.
I do think that the show threw a lot of new concepts at us, right? I feel like it took us 4 seasons to understand like how business works, and then all of a sudden it's like now I'm just talking at you like this is an episode of The West Wing, and I want to know how you think that would go down with audiences. Like Jesse Armstrong has form in real solid political stuff, like from the thick of it in the UK. He was a regular writer on Veep. A lot of this stuff reminded me of some of the episodes of Veep, though they're less dark and more satirical. There's a great election episode of that show called Nevada, where there's just like a debate about whether you pronounce Nevada or Nevada. And when they just throw these swing state names, I'm like, okay, cool. This is funny and interesting, but there's a knowledge of US politics here that I think it's assumed that the audience has it. Do you think people will be along for the ride, or is there a risk that we all end up feeling a bit like, oh my God, I kind of don't even know what happened. What the hell is Milwaukee a state or a city? Like, what's going on?
I think it was, I think even, and every person who doesn't know heaps about American politics would be able to follow it, because you kind of get the central concept.
Well, it's a brutal burn on Thomas's wife.
Yeah.
Even the lowest common denominator will. No, but I also think there's a lot of it, like, I think Jesse Armstrong probably knows or likes to think that his audience is... He's writing for an audience that will get this, and if you don't, well, then bad luck. And I also think, like, we all talk about Succession endlessly to people. Like, I think people who like Succession fancy themselves as the kinds of people that will understand this. And even if they don't, and like, yeah, for sure, some stuff in this, I was like, wait a minute, like, this is a show that gets heavily paused by people, I would say. So there's a lot of Googling mid-episode. So I think it's not confusing enough that it'll totally throw people. But yeah, for sure, it was... we were straight into it. There was no kind of like slowly, like soft launching you into the like election night.
I feel like lately Thomas and I have just been slacking references to see if the other person gets it.
Yeah, there was a lot of Schrodinger's cat chat today at work.
Yeah, I was hoping you might be able to explain that to Thomas, but he alleges he knew what it was.
Well, when we get to that... No, Thomas knows Schrodinger. Thomas, why don't you explain Schrodinger's cat?
I will when we get to it.
Let's start our characters sort of chat by focusing on Tom. I feel like in a way he was kind of the anchor of this thing. He sort of kicked off the episode in a pretty chaotic and stressed out state of mind. He was listening to Greg, all the things he's worried about. He's got PGN coming for him on the left. He's got some other network coming for him on the right. He's got crazy owners who want to kill him, and he has to deliver the biggest ratings numbers ever. Doing coke at the beginning of election night is pretty intense, and he kind of did lead him to be, I think, maybe a little bit more aggressive than we've seen him before, to a point where like Kendall told him to like fucking watch himself, right? Like when he had to go at Shiv. How do you guys think he went? Did he manage to juggle all of those competing responsibilities, or did he end up just kind of bowing to the loudest voice in the room?
I actually thought he did a bit of both. Like, at the start, it was no doubt incredibly chaotic. It was like watching someone unravel in real time. I loved when he gave Tom the speech about, like, essentially, if you don't get coffee, we'll all be back to amoebas or whatever. He gives this, like, long kind of, like, all the different dominoes that will fall over if he doesn't get his coffee. And tonight, he just needs him to be Greg. So he started off very chaotic, and he was clearly, like, crumbling under the pressure of it. But I actually thought he started to come good. Like, once the kids got really, really involved and pushing their own agendas, I thought he was quite strong in being like, you can't be on the floor, you can't be on the floor. Like, he was not having them down there, like, whispering in producers' ears or whatever. So he kind of, like, started to stand up. But, yeah, it was a strange episode for Tom, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, but, he was very cold in his, like, big moment with Shiv. But generally, I'm giving him, like, if it was a report card election night, I'd give him like a B plus.
Oh my gosh, I love Tom in this episode so much. I thought he was so much fun. And also, firstly, I like, because he's been up all night, right? He's had this fight with Shiv on the balcony and then he's had to back it up. We know he was already very tired.
It's true.
And I actually think the actor looked like he hadn't slept in actual days. And there was this real sense of tiredness, but I thought he was so good in it. I really like also the idea that we don't actually we don't see these characters do much actual work, which is realistic. The higher up the chain you get, the further you get from the tools of production. But I loved that we saw Tom.
Yeah, I want to get promoted to that level where you don't actually have to do any work and you just sort of make phone calls.
Yeah,
That's
you're just looking for new green screens.
So I loved seeing Tom on the floor having to do actual work, and he's like freaking out about the touch screens not working, and I loved seeing him like he's managing down, like Pam and him are not getting on, and then there's this one moment where he's speaking to the siblings and you hear him desperately say, "Stop micromanaging me." So he's like managing up. I like seeing him actually do the work.
Yeah, and I think it is quite stressful to have such a political job with 3 different siblings who all think that they're kind of in control. One of them is your wife that you're in this really stressful relationship with. And he was kind of, it reminded me of him on that plane. Like he is, when Logan died, he is kind of competent in a way. Like he can manage the flow of information and get stuff done. I was a bit worried the first half of this episode that it was not going to grapple with that emotional fallout from his big fight with Shiv. Because we saw them interacting, we saw her and Tom on screen together, but we didn't get a sense of where things were at. But then they have that confrontation in a hallway where she sort of pulls him aside amidst all of this and tries to apologize. I guess does her Shiv thing of, I went too far, I don't really care about you, but it's tactically helpful for me to have you on my side, so let's try and apologize. And he is having none of it. Like that was, I think, kind of revealing that she's giving him an olive branch and he spits in her face. Like the line about, how he responded when she told him she had a kid, like Thomas, that was brutal.
That was so brutal. And, I fall into this trap all the time in Succession, but again, I was like, oh, I feel for Shiv here. Like, she tells him in this like rush of information, I'm pregnant and it's your child. And he says like, is that even true? Is that a new position or a tactic? And at that moment, she genuinely looks like shattered by that response. Like we know that this has been kind of eating her up along with everything else. And, putting aside all of their noise and everything that goes on with them, that did feel like a genuinely vulnerable moment for her. And he just like crushed her. Like, I found that hard to watch, and I found that like an unattractive side of Tom Wamsgans. Like, I know you think she's the worst person, she is your Scorpion, but like, surely when you've known someone inside out for however many years they've been together, you can tell when they're really opening up, and he just like didn't.
I think I've got a bit more of a cynical take on it. Like, I think Shiv, when that conversation starts, she's getting nothing out of him. And we know that their relationship is this really fiery back and forth. And he's just kind of shut down. He's giving nothing to her. So she brings out this information, I think, to kind of break that wall that he has put up. I saw it as actually, like, obviously she did seem genuinely hurt when he responded that way. But I did see that as her desperate attempt to reconnect with Tom by offering something that she knows he wants so much, which is a child. But I did really like, because we were talking last week about how Shiv kept describing everything as a tactical move, and then he reused that word directly against her, which I thought was quite a nice throwback to it.
The dynamic between the siblings in this episode was at its absolute peak, I think, in terms of seeing the games within games, right? Like, nominally, these guys are all still supposed to be together. Like, whenever they catch up together, they're all, like, on the same page. But then the second they leave the room, they're doing their own sort of thing. So they're all supposed to be trying to stop the Gojo merger. We know that Shiv is not involved in that anymore. She's built this alliance with Matsson and has sort of done the deal with the Swedish devil. Roman and Kendall then are kind of, again, nominally, the two co-CEOs running the show. But we know that Kendall's already said that he's going to basically screw Roman over and try and do a reverse takeover, pillage the village, etc. And we also know that Roman is much closer to Jared Mencken than Kendall is. There is such a fascinating web of tension there. And there was one particular scene, I think, like towards the end of the episode, where they're all in a room debating what they should do with the call, and everyone's base primal motivations came out there. Like, it just seems like it's hard for these guys to do anything like a reconciliation with the 2 episodes that we've got left.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Like that scene in the room when they're basically making the call in Wisconsin was probably one of the hottest scenes in Succession. Like, you're so right. Like, it's so rare for a show in 60 minutes. Like every sibling, every like combination of siblings had an incredible moment with the other combinations. It was just like all of them were out for it, and yeah, that particular scene just kind of laid it all bare. I don't really see a way back for the siblings, like in terms of they definitely won't be on the same team again. But that felt like the biggest breaking point because it felt. All of their self-interest was obvious, but also there was like a lot of ideological stuff there, and whether or not you put too much value in it or you think they're all just like using it as a cover, it still felt like that was the moment for the kids. That was the last we'll ever see of them being siblings.
Yeah, and I thought you saw with the 3 of them all in one place, you saw all their kind of business styles brought to the fore. Roman's kind of recklessness, which maybe played out in his favour, Kendall's kind of dithering, and Shiv's strategy, which was ultimately to kind of walk a tightrope wire between the 2 camps, and she ended up falling. You saw it all, the way they've kind of handled this situation, all really obviously put in front of you when you saw them all together like that.
I want to ask you guys what you think about that fight between Roman and Shiv, where Shiv is kind of imploring them to not do it because of the political consequences. We know that Shiv has a history working with progressive political candidates. She's flagged earlier in this season that she is really worried about where things are going, and you've got to draw a line somewhere. But at the end of the day, like, she's still part of this whole institution. She's not really willing to step outside. How much of her concern about the result is actually based on her real political beliefs, if she has them, versus her desire to keep the Gojo merger happening?
I think I think I have a cynical approach to Shiv at the moment. Maybe I'm a bit like Tom. I feel the trust has been broken. Everything's a tactic.
Who hurt you, Mel? Who hurt you?
I think that, and she does say when she calls Mattson to update him, and obviously we need to reserve some time to talk about the pants he was wearing. They were fantastic. And the fact he used his finger as a little stirring stick of his drink. Yeah. Great move. I know you guys are big fans of him. Madison Bros.
Thank you, Mel. Always happy to talk about his pants. Yeah.
When she's on the phone to him, she says it's good for democracy, but it's great for us. And I think that kind of sums up her position.
Yeah, I think I'm still like less cynical. I think, for all her self-interest, again, I mean, maybe Sarah Snook's just a really good actress, which we know she is, but like she really sold it to me. Like she seemed to be like at her most pleading, like base level, like, come on guys, like we know we all talk shit and we love to do this, like I'm going to stuff 1 million dicks down your throat if we don't blah, blah, blah. But like this, at the end of the day, this is not a game. Like, and they all kind of did it to each other a few times, but it was so much like bringing back of Logan, like not even Dad would do this. Even Dad had a line, like she was like, we cannot like choose fascism and choose this crazy right-wing candidate just because it's going to benefit our deal. Like this is going too far. We have to rein it in now.
But to be honest, she could have done that years ago. Like it's not like ATN suddenly became right-wing. We've seen this manifesting over episodes and episodes. So if she was genuine, why now on election eve when the polls have closed, the votes have been counted? I
guess it's all kind of though like materialized in this one Wisconsin decision where it becomes to represent everything. Like if we call it, we are, like fully like hedging our bets on this decision. And if we don't, then we can kind of like save the future of this country. Yeah,
the way that I sort of I think about that is Roman is clearly like out with Mencken. Like Roman might not have politics. He might just be like quite, I think, sexually obsessed with Jared Mencken. But if he does have politics, they seem to be pretty far right as well. Kendall and Shiv, I feel like there's something, that kind of want to see themselves as part of this like more liberal, cool, progressive class of people. But every time they have an opportunity to sacrifice their own personal gain to help that cause, they don't take it, right? Like Kendall at the start of this episode is again reminded of the consequences of electing Jared Mencken on his family, on his daughter, and that could be a thing that just completely overrides everything else. He could say, "Hey, we're going to back Jimenez, and we're not going to play this game with Jared Mencken," but he doesn't do that, and ultimately he comes down on the side of Mencken, regardless of what that would mean for his family. Shiv, similarly, like Shiv. Do you remember that episode in season 3 when Logan is like anointing Mencken, and there's that fight between him and Shiv where he wants Shiv in the photo. And Shiv is like, I don't want to be in the photo. He says, you want anything to do with this family, you've got to be in the photo. So Shiv is willing to sacrifice those principles for her own gain. And again, in this episode, the one we've just seen, she threatens to leak stuff and blow it up. But again, she decides, I'll cop it and I'll play my internal game with Matsson because I want ATN to exist in some capacity because that's where my strength comes from. Like, there is an instinct for them to be cool, but they are always being pushed back towards like the selfishness. I think that's my takeaway from the end.
And I think this is why Kendall is so cooked, really, in a way, because to win in business, I think you probably have to be cutthroat and put business instincts above everything else, which is required for him to lead Waystar to success, potentially, versus this idea that he wants to be the good guy. And so he's always torn between those two things. And what makes him a success in one field is what's making him a failure in the other, and vice versa. So he's kind of built this rod for himself that he can't get out of.
Yeah, but then the irony I think about all of it is that, like, ultimately what sends Kendall over the edge, because like essentially it really comes down to Kendall, because we've got like Roman so clearly Team Mencken, Shiv so clearly Team Jimenez, and then Kendall's the one who's like, you know, to and froing the entire episode. And then when he finds out from Greg that Shiv has betrayed them with Matsson, that betrayal stings so bad and comes back to, like, really the only, like, you know, he claims to care about his daughter. The only family that really matters to them are the siblings and their father. Like, that's the nuclear unit. And when he finds out that he's been betrayed by his sister, that's what pushes him over. He comes back into the room and he's like, we're with Mencken. We're calling it for Mencken. Because, like, you know, that family betrayal, like, that cuts him really deep. And so, you know, family does matter. It's just like which family we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that moment where Kendall almost uses Shiv as a therapist was quite interesting as well, where he says, I'm just gonna be honest with you, like, this is my actual like thoughts about this. I am thinking about cutting you guys out. That's like pretty honest. I am worried about Roman because of how close he is to Mencken. That's pretty honest. And it's almost opportunity. Like, I don't know if Shiv could have avoided that result if she'd said to him, hey, I've got something I need to be honest with you about as well. But it might have avoided, you know, the situation that we saw at the end of the episode. And he is just so pissed off that he spilt his guts and she didn't give him anything.
I wondered about that scene, if he was like, if that was him trying to test her on Matsson. Like, I thought, was he trying to suss her out and be like, you know, because we're all in on, I think he says we're all in on Matsson, you know, and she's like, yeah. Like, I wonder if he was kind of like sussing out, oh, okay, I think maybe she might be playing us, and then soon after that he learns. But that was a great scene, and you know, I think when he's like, I don't know, does the poison drip through? I was like, oh, that's I feel for him so bad.
I loved when they were watching, you saw Shiv inside that glass room and you could see her looking out at Kendall and Greg talking, and it was so tense, and you could just see everything was hanging in the balance in that moment.
Yeah, there's nothing worse. You know when you know when you've told a lie and you're like watching in real time yourself be caught out? It's fucking excruciating. Yeah, and like
it was the best thing I've ever seen like that on TV. And her stuttering, her inability to say anything. It's, you've been caught out in a lie. The consequences are massive, and you have literally nothing to say. Like, it's not even a lie that you can come up with an excuse for. It's her acting. What she can do with her face and her stutters and stuff is super, super special.
Yeah, she's weaponized the stutter.
We haven't spent a lot of this season talking about Greg specifically, but I think we've got to spend a couple of minutes talking about where he's at, because he, after spending, firstly, this stamina on this guy, right? Like, out with Matsson all night partying, looks pretty good, you know, is kind of running the show, is you know, doing maybe a tiny bump or pretending to with Tom. He's at the center of it all, right? He's got this close relationship with Matsson. He's sussed out that he's working with Shiv. He's still being seen as pretty trustworthy and reliable by Tom and Kendall as well. It's like he's kind of the last man standing in a way.
I kind of want to see his night out with the Swedes as a spin-off episode, because what went on with that bearded Oscar, like what went down. But I think I was thinking as I was watching this, like, part of the reason Greg has got this, Matsson's spilled this information to him, and it's because Greg has this really disarming effect, and because people don't take him seriously, they seem to, and that was Shiv's misstep in this episode too. She didn't take him seriously. People seem to confess to him, and I think Matsson calls him a normalist, and that's how they all kind of how they kind of pursue him. That's all how they kind of view him. And I think in this, it was pretty interesting. You saw things have happened to him rather than him actively making them happen. While everyone else has sought power, it's kind of landed in his lap through these unexpected measures. But I thought Tom's advice to him, which later came to bear when he threw Shiv under the bus, that, information's like a fine wine, pick when you use it and then smash someone in the face with it. He obviously listened to that advice and it played out in this episode.
Yeah, this was like MVP times for Greg. It was so good because it's just summed him up perfectly. Greg is the man that does buy the bodega sushi, but he's also the man that pushes the button that changes the shape of democracy. Like he can do it all. He's a one-man show.
Also loves wasabi. Has a taste.
I think he deliberately pushed that container with wasabi on it to try and screw over Darwin. I feel like that was pretty deliberate because otherwise, why was so much chat about Greg buying wasabi? Why was Greg eating wasabi in that scene? You go back and you rewatch that scene and the signs are there that Greg was trying to stop Darwin from making the wrong call, on behalf of his alliances.
And I think there was a shot where they show him kind of edge it towards him as well. Yeah, man, Greg, it's good to see him like back in the action proper and not just like, the comedic fall guy.
Though he must have the biggest HR suit. Like he's been, he's had to do some awful things. Like I like when he says that Matsson treated him abominably. So he's got a HR suit against Matsson. He's like, Tom's making him do coke. Shiv is kind of being like having a bit of sexual innuendo with him in a closet. That man has got a big case.
He does have dirt on every single person. Yeah,
he really does. And talking about like the great facial acting in this episode, when after he's had the chat with Kendall and Kendall's going back inside to blow up Shiv, she looks out to the glass office and he walks back and he just like does these like raised eyebrows and it's amazing. It's just like, well, like, what did you fucking expect me to do?
That brings us to the best lines of the episode because mine is one of Greg's because Greg talks about La Croix. I love La Croix. I'm a big La Croix guy. Ruby, our producer, is also a big La Croix guy. I think she probably, cheered when there was a La Croix reference in this episode. And this is when Greg is pouring the drink all over Darwin's face to flush out the wasabi, and someone says it's lemonade and he yells out, "It's La Croix, it's not that lemony, it's just a hint of lemon." And then a few minutes later we have Tom yelling back that he shouldn't get anything lemony or wasabi in Darwin's eye. Again, it's incredible to have these just like absurd slapstick moments in a show that is so otherwise like grim and heavy.
Okay, I've never tried this drink. How often are you having it?
You never have La Croix? It's like a I don't know where you can get it from in the Sydney office. In the Melbourne office, there's like a service station that has them. Easy Marts have them. Thank you.
I feel like if the guys from the choir are listening, this is like a mad sponsorship opportunity.
If you're not across it, it's basically like a slightly sparkling water with flavors. It's 0 calorie, so it's not like drinking a soft drink, but you get something fun in your mouth.
But just a hint of it.
Okay,
just a hint of it, yeah.
If you poured it in your eye, do you think your reaction would be what Darwin's was? Like, was he overacting?
No, I don't want it in my eye. I don't want it in my eye. Yeah, you don't want it in your eyes. Definitely. Yeah.
Fact checked.
I think you've got a food and drink related one as well, Mel.
I do. I loved that Connor came into the show midway through. He passed on the ambassadorship. He now regrets that. He's trying to renegotiate a deal for himself, and him and Willa are talking about what they should do. And she says, "I'm torn." And he's very right wing, but Vienna for lunch, Venice for dinner, and Connor chimes in, Dubrovnik for breakfast. And I love that even on this smaller episode, you're seeing these moral values go out the window in line for personal gain. And I also very much enjoy it was in this scene as well. You know that aide to him that we kept talking about?
The Colonel.
Yeah.
Sanders. He also appeared in this episode and he had one line. Yeah. And it was, if it's going to happen anywhere, it's going to happen in Kentucky.
Which feels incredibly fitting, yes.
Kentucky Fried Chicken,
yes.
That's right.
Exactly. I was like, maybe
Connor's
you're onto something.
Connor's knowledge of global geography in the last 2 episodes is absolutely astonishing. Like, good on him for knowing the capital cities of various Eastern European countries. And as we said last week, his knowledge of the GDP of the Middle East. Thomas, what have you got?
Yes, weirdly, mine is also food related. So maybe we were all like a bit peckish when we were watching this episode. I thought this was a very funny exchange between Like, I love when the kids are talking about things that are so serious and debating essentially the fate of, the free world. And they always kind of like scale it back to their like sibling rivalry when they were kids. And they're kind of arguing about Roman saying that whenever we were younger, I always wanted to have beef and you always wanted to have chicken. And we always had chicken. And then Kendall says, well, they didn't want to give you beef. And because if you threw a tantrum, that would mean you won and you'd always get your way. And that's how you would, think the world works. And so then Kendall says, what, so because we had so much chicken when we were kids, I have to elect a fascist? Which I thought was amazing. Just like so amazing. Like this, in
that one scene, right? They just managed to be so sharp about what this episode was about, which is that these kids' weird issues from their parents are what is dictating every decision they make. And we've got this lunatic in the White House because they couldn't agree on what to eat for dinner, and like. That's nuts.
Exactly. And then that's the most depressing thing. Like, literally nothing has changed since these kids were like arguing about what to have for dinner. And this is like the second reference we've had in a few episodes, because like a few episodes ago, Shiv was like, oh, Dad, I spilt my chocolate milk in the Mercedes or whatever. Like, these kids are fucked up.
It was a Range Rover, I believe.
Yeah,
Thomas,
yeah.
That's real rich people who drive Range Rovers.
Sorry. They don't have a Mazda 3? That's weird.
All right, time for Fun Fact Corner, which I've wrested from Thomas this week, because I literally yelped and jumped out of my chair when I saw this guy. Like that Leonardo DiCaprio in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood meme where he points at the screen. So we've talked a bit about Darwin, right, who's the numbers guy. He's the decision desk guy for ATN. He's played by a British actor called Adam Godley. You might recognize him from The Great or Breaking Bad. And I think, is it Thomas, you a Suits fan? Is he?
Yes, he was also Nigel in Suits. And he played like a very slimy British character who kind of came in mid-season and was like almost going to take over one of the law firms. He was very, very slimy. And that was my moment when I saw him. I was like, oh my God, it's the Suits guy. But yeah, he was great in this.
So my thing was I sort of recognized him from The Great, but I'm like, oh, he's the guy from Love Actually, the iconic Richard Curtis rom-com. He's one of the teachers. He's got a very small role. He's one of the teachers involved in the Christmas play. At the end of the movie, he introduces Joanna, who's the girl who sings the Mariah Carey song, and he has a really funny line in there. He's like, some of the staff have decided to take part in this pageant as well, and for that we ask you to forgive us. It's a great line. His acting in it is awesome. I've always thought he was an MVP of that film, and now he's popped up in this. You guys got Love Actually thoughts? Into it? Not into it?
So into it. Watched it probably once or twice every festive season, and seen it at the what's the one where they do in the park where you go and watch the Moonlight Cinema.
Moonlight Cinema?
Yeah.
Nice.
Taking Kate out.
No, we went alone.
Mel, I feel like you might have controversial Love Actually thoughts.
Oh my God, she hates anything sweet and saccharine. So like, yeah, she'll be like, oh my God, I hate Love Actually. Love is a lie.
No, I love it. And I had that song in my head then for the rest of the, for the next 24 hours from Love Actually. I thought he was one of my favourite characters in this, like the human abacus. I thought he was so good, particularly when they were having that moment of like whether they call it a call or a pending call or not quite a call.
Yeah.
I thought he was very good in that.
Like Succession is so good at giving you like maybe like a C plot character for 1 or 2 episodes that's really great, and he was exactly that. Like he was fully in the episode. We probably will never see him again, but he was such a like, you really walked away from the episode being like, yeah, I remember him.
But then I started to think about how in all these last few episodes we've seen all these kind of every people who are maybe meant to be representative of us fail to stand up to power, like that accountant, the video editor, and now the human abacus. And I kind of thought, oh, is that us? That's like,
probably.
Yeah, this is all happening because a number of people also
it is.
are
It's a really good point, Mel.
It.
It's like a reminder that all of these things are maybe decided by these powerful godlike figures, but it requires people at every level of the chain to implement. There's so many normal people who could call bullshit and just like step out, be whistleblowers, just not physically do it, and then they kind of squib it. It makes me think, I don't know if we've talked about it this season yet, but there are so many people I know who work for Sky News, who work for News Corp, who work for Rupert Murdoch companies, who love this show and like watch it unironically and think it's such a great TV show about crazy kids who run a right-wing media company. When you watch an episode like this and you see all these like low-level flunkies enabling fascism, I wonder if there's any of them who think like, are we the baddies? Like, what's going on here?
All of my friends work for NGOs, so I don't know, man.
Yeah, I thought the same, and also the journalists in it, they were kind of just props, really, of the powerful people. Like, they were handed the talking points, they were given the touch boards. There was no autonomy in those scenes. They were just kind of mouthpieces for big business and power.
Yeah, the casting as well is so good. Like, so many Megyn Kelly lookalikes on that panel.
I was going to say, I also really enjoyed the Ravenhead, like, off script, down the barrel, like, I'm going to give it to you, like, when you get home and your son, who may be your daughter, is now sitting there, like, and the, government's in your home. I was just like, this is amazing. And again, so, like, I mean, they couldn't have scripted all this, but everything that's happened with Tucker Carlson at News, and even earlier last week announcing he's having his own show on Twitter, like, all of that noise around Fox's biggest, most controversial talking head, and then the way things work out with Ravenhead and his role in last night's episode, amazing.
Your son, who may be your daughter, is such a sharp line. It's ridiculous. Jerry Watch this week doesn't really work because there was not a single sighting of Jerry. Yeah, she's out of there. I feel like we can make this Graybeard Watch instead because they were completely absent from the actual day-to-day running of ATN. They were like in a boardroom somewhere just watching things go on, kind of like, the peanut gallery, just kind of commenting on the things that were going on. And I thought every single line they delivered was absolutely amazing. Like Frank saying, when Connor announces he's sort of conceding, he goes, Connor was running for president, and they all laugh. They're like, we get to see their reaction, that they're just having a great time cracking up. It was really good. Any highlights from the Graybeards from you guys?
I thought that whole thing was amazing. It just, like, straight away, as soon as we saw them there together, I was like, I bet you those guys have a WhatsApp thread where they, like, obviously just bitch about the kids and stuff. And, like, someone probably dumped in a message in the morning like, hey, should we watch the election tonight, lol? And then they're like, yeah, we'll go to Frank's or whatever. Like, it was just so good to see them together hanging shit on the kids. And I loved Hugo. Hugo has been so angry this season ever since he met that, like, guy who nearly got fourth at the Olympics. He's been so angry. And I love when Hugo's watching Jimenez and he's kind of, like, getting more and more angry. And he's like, flop your dick out, pop a nut, do something. Like, he's just so furious at the whole process. That was a great aside for them to include.
That was 100% the party I would have wanted to be at on election night. And I liked that they had, like, their whiskies out and then they had the catering on the table and they were obviously just having a great time. And there's also, like, some level of irony too that they have been involved in setting this moment into motion. Like, everything they have done over decades is what has made this happen. And they're just kind of sitting back, having a good time, watching it all unfold.
But was it telling that Jerry wasn't there?
Yeah, I think so. Like, these guys I think are still working for the company. They're just, like, not part of what's going on that night. Jerry is out. She's, negotiating the terms of a settlement. Who knows what she's up to. But I think, it's significant that she's out of the picture.
And they did say that ATN has strong security, so she probably couldn't get into the building.
Yeah, Jerry has left the group.
Okay, time for our winners and losers. Mel, why don't you go first this time?
Oh, thank you. So I gave 3 points to Greg because I thought he was Gregging in a big way, big Greg energy, and it really worked for him. So ultimately, he's ended this episode in with Matsson, in with the Roy Bros. He's in a good spot. And I gave 2 points. 2 points to Tom. I think he deserves a bit of a shout out in the All-Star for his election coverage. He's back with the Roy Bros. He's created a gap between him and Shiv. Obviously, some issues to work out there. Though I do wonder. I know that at the end of the episode, he was watching the TV and it was calling him out as making the call about the election. So I do wonder if that might come back on him. 1 point I've given to Roman. At least he's getting things done, unlike the other ditherers. And then my loser went to Matsson, even though he's got, which I know you guys will be very upset about, even though he's got great pajama pants, I think he might be in trouble with this election.
I was originally, like, when I saw you give Greg 3 points, I was like, oh, really? But then the more I thought about it, I was like, yeah, like, he quietly is just winning. We talked about him earlier as amassing power and building relationships. Thomas, take it away.
Firstly, this is the biggest case of voter fraud since the fucking election last night. Why can't you give Kendall a point? It's ridiculous. It's like obscene.
Yeah, 3 points for being sad Kendall the whole time. It's just a lot of fun.
Kendall will win this season, if only on the backs of Osman and I, consistently giving him points. I gave Roman 3 points because, ultimately his hitched his wagon to the crazy man, and he's the president-elect. So, Roman came out on top. Kendall, I gave 2 points because, look, he did show some heart and he was torn and everything, but ultimately he was on the winning side. He made the call to go with Mencken, who appears, at least as it stands, to have won. And I gave Tom 1 point similar for why Mel did, because, he handled things well. He did get overawed, but kind of brought it back. And at the end of the day, he's still running ATN. And my loser was Shiv again, second time in a few weeks, I think, because, she's hitched her wagon to Madsen. She's now on the outer. Mencken appears to be the president-elect, and essentially she's all at sea once more.
Okay, I didn't give Shiv, I didn't make her a loser, though I can see why you have, because I thought that end scene where she was like doubling down with Madsen, I was like, Shiv's not going to go down without a fight. Like, she is going to come back hard.
Yeah, I don't know.
So, she was also my loser because I just feel like every episode she tries and like ends up with fewer allies than before. My points were very similar to yours, Thomas. Roman 3, Kendall 2, but like Mel, I thought, Greg's playing a game, and like there is like a fan theory doing the rounds that Greg will quote unquote like win the show, whatever that means. Like there'd be a great sort of like poetic irony to it, going from him in that Doderick suit to being like the last man standing at the end of it. The tally is pretty interesting. The main change, Shiv has fallen out of the top 3, which is a pretty tight contest between Tom, Kendall, and Roman. Okay, predictions for next week. I keep predicting people are going to jail, and they aren't, so I could be totally wrong about that, though I still think there's a chance, but perhaps just slim. Yeah, Greg is nailing it. Like I said, I think we may be, like, I don't think there's going to be a point where it's like the show ends with Jesse Armstrong and a title card flashing up saying, Greg won the show. But I do think Greg's continual relationship building and cultivation is going to put him in a powerful position where he potentially screwed over Shiv in this episode. I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up cutting one of the other siblings loose as well. Thomas, give us your prediction.
Well, we know that Mel's prediction for the last 6 weeks is finally coming true. The next episode is Logan's funeral.
Guys,
we learn
I called it.
Yeah, finally.
Make me a writer.
Luckily we got Nostradamus here. We know.
They're paying that morgue a lot of rates to keep that body frozen.
Yeah, seriously. Yes, we know via Kendall talking to his wife in the closing scene that the next day is Logan's funeral. So I guess I'm not sure what's going to happen this is not really a prediction as such, so I'm sorry for disappointing our listeners. I think the next episode will be the best episode of the season. I think there will be too much pressure.
That's a prediction.
That's the definition of a prediction.
Yeah, but like I'm not predicting anything specific, but like I think there's going to be too much pressure on the finale. But I just think the idea of Logan's funeral after the chaos that we've just witnessed, they're about to bury their father, they've just buried the country, everyone from Succession Universe is going to be in this episode, you would assume. I just feel like it has the potential to be like a disaster in the best way possible. So yeah, that's my kind of
So
prediction.
you're predicting the final episode is going to be a flop?
No, but just not as good as the 9th. The penultimate one will be my episode of the series.
Was it Breaking Bad that had like a really great penultimate episode?
Yes, that was exactly what I was
just
thinking.
Like, yeah. Mel, give us your prediction.
I think Madsen, Mencken, and the siblings all in one place, best wake ever. So I think they're all going to be there and it's going to go off. I was also wondering, do we think, I really thought she would come back, Kerry. I thought Kerry would come back in some significant way. And I wonder, although there's not much of the show left, if there's going to be some blasts from the past adding like this final level of drama. I really thought that she would come in to play a role in all of this, but maybe
I
not.
feel like at the funeral you'll see Carrie and there could be some.
I reckon she'll be the one that she'll get like tanked too early and do something embarrassing and then be escorted out and be murdered and left in a ditch.
Whoa.
Cut that.
That got dark.
It was dark. I also hope we see Logan's bodyguard, Colin, because I just want to know what he's been up to. Like, keeping well, who's he guarding now?
Yeah, he'll be there in jeans sobbing, for sure.
Thomas and Mel.
The coffin. Sorry.
Thomas and Mel, thank you for another cracking episode. See you next week.
Buonasera.
Bella.